Good morning, viewer. Welcome to our Fossack TV. Here is some alarming news for the world population. Why the sparsely populated South Pacific islands have become the next US-China context. The island nation that stretch across the South Pacific, sparsely populated atolls and volcanic archipelagos known more from tourism than lucrative natural resources may not seem at first glance to a major geopolitical prize. Yet, Pacific Island countries have become the latest arena for a great power context between the United States and China. That context was thrown into sharp focus in recent days as China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi completed a 10-day tour of 8 countries to promote cooperation and a sweeping regional security and economic proposal with the potential and significantly ramp up Beijing's role in the South Pacific. Wang's trip and news of that proposed deal sent the power with long-standing relationships in the South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States scrambling, with Washington pledging last week to intensify its own support of the region and Canberra dispatching its foreign minister on a dwelling diplomatic tour. Some Pacific Island leaders pushed back on the posturing, stressing instead the importance of other issues such as climate change, with Fiji's Prime Minister Josia Voriko Banimama noting their geopolitical points scoring means less than little to anyone whose community is sleeping beneath the rising seas. China's bid for a larger regional pact ultimately did not win backing at a 10-country meeting last week. But Wang did leap behind a clear message of China's interest in the region and written concern that these island nations, which carry history of strategic importance, will have little choice but to navigate the rising tensions between major powers. From the vantage point of Washington and Canberra, Beijing is bolstering ties with capitals across the South Pacific so it can potentially seek to parlay infrastructure deals or even seemingly modest security agreements into a military foothold. That would drive a wedge into the two countries' military presence in the South Pacific, where the US maintains military bases and a compact of free association with the Federated States of Micronesia, that is called FSM, the Republic of Marshall Islands, that is called RMI, and the Republic of Palau, which gives it military operating rights over the airspace and waters of these nations. Australia operates its own navy in the region and has long maintained defense and security ties with neighboring island governments, including on peacekeeping and military training. Both Australia and New Zealand are part of regional and bilateral security pacts in the Pacific. The region was included in a joint statement between US President Joe Biden and New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern last week, which voiced concern about the establishment of a persistent military presence in the Pacific by a state that does not share our values. And for the US and Australia, threats to the regional status quo have echoes of World War II, when the islands were used by Imperial Japan to threaten Australia before becoming part of an American Iceland hopping offensive that ultimately played into the turning tide in the Pacific. The islands sit astride a key passageway for US and Australian naval ships and merchant ships, said Timothy Heath, a senior international defense researcher at the RAND Corporation in Arlington. If China could establish that's called the military basing rights, it could deploy warships and aircraft temporarily to the island. Its ships and airplanes could threaten US and Australian ships and aircraft that passed by, say, adding that even a boasted presence, sort of a military one, could help China collect sensitive intelligence on US and Australian military operations. China's interest in building rapport with the Pacific Islands countries is not new. In the early 2000s as the US was turning its attention towards perceived threats in the Middle East. A newly outward-looking China was starting on a path to become an economic and diplomatic partner for Pacific Island countries, not least of all as it sought to win friends away from Taiwan, which is now only formally recognized by 4 of 14 South Pacific nations after the Solomon Islands and Kiribati switched allegiance to China in 2019. In the recent years, as Beijing has pursued a more assertive foreign policy and expanded development funding globally in a bid to enhance its international sway, its visibility in the Pacific Island too has grown. China has backed widely publicized projects in some Pacific Island countries. A national sports stadium to host the Pacific Games in the Solomon Islands, highways in Papua New Guinea, bridges in Fiji, and sent high-level envoys to the region, including 2 visits from Chinese leader Xi Jinping, once in 2014 and again in 2018. It's also become a major trading partner for Pacific Islands economies. And while Australia has remained the top aid donor in the region for the past 5 years, according to data collected by the Australian think tank Lowy Institute, experts say that in some part, perceptions are that China is a more expedient partner than traditional donors. There is an assumption that China will do more, said Selas Talifilu, a political advisor based in Solomon Islands, Malaysia province, who has been an outspoken critic of how the national government has handled its recent relations with China. It may be that our politicians are thinking that it is easier to deal with China in terms of implementing things on the ground quickly, in comparison to other donors that have been in the Solomons for a long time yet have been very slow. Beyond the report for Sakti USA.